Hi everyone. I wanted to make a video in which I talk about how to create a good thesis statement for writing project 2. In this video, I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm going to talk about how your thesis needs to be a statement and not a question. I'm going to talk about how you need to be making a claim, not an announcement. I'm going to talk about how your thesis needs to be at most 2 sentences. I'm going to talk about how your thesis needs to mention your lens text. You also need to just focus on your images. A good thesis will be a thesis that is specific, and you should also avoid using you or a second person. So first of all, your thesis should be a statement, not a question. So oftentimes thesis statements will result from a question. So many researchers begin with a research question. Why does something happen the way that it does? What do people think about this? So on and so forth. That itself, though, the research question is not the thesis. Your thesis is often an answer to your research question. So when you're creating a thesis statement, it does need to be a declarative statement. You shouldn't be asking anything. So my wrong example here, why do advertisements often infantilize women? This would be incorrect because it is a question. The correct version would be, the images below demonstrate Kilbourne's idea that women are often infantilized in ads. Next, your thesis should be a claim and not an announcement of what you are doing. A claim is something that is debatable or something that can be argued or proven. It should be your take on the issue, or what the conclusion that you have reached after conducting your analysis. Your thesis should not be an announcement of what you are going to be doing. So, my wrong example here, I'm going to talk about how my images show how masculinity is often linked to violence in mass media. So there you'll notice that I am announcing what I am doing. I'm going to talk about how. This can take other forms as well. I will be addressing. I have conducted an analysis. In general, you want to avoid announcing what you are doing to your readers. Usually, they can just figure it out for themselves. And by avoiding that kind of announcement language, you're able to get to the point a little bit quicker. So the correct version, as Kat suggests, masculinity is often linked to violence in mass media, and my 2 advertisements reveal this idea through their verbal and visual content. So getting straight to the point, making a claim, something that can be developed or demonstrated over the course of the paper. Next, your thesis should be max 2 sentences. Now, if you ever get to the point where you are writing much longer papers, then it could become appropriate to have a thesis that is, maybe 3 sentences or 4 sentences. But generally, you want your thesis to be pretty concise, pretty to the point. In my experience, the more that you try to cram into your thesis, the harder it will be to develop it thoroughly. The harder it will be to make sure that you're fully demonstrating everything that you are talking about. Additionally, the longer your thesis is, the more likely your reader is going to have a hard time finding it or identifying it. And this is a common issue that I actually have when I am grading people's papers, is I'll find, 3, maybe 4 sentences that all kind of sound like a thesis, but it's hard to draw the line. It's hard to really tell where their thesis actually begins. And that's not something that you want your reader to be confused about. They should be able to easily identify your thesis. So my wrong example here, Kilburn asserts that men and women are often portrayed in drastically different ways in contemporary advertising. The 2 images below, one for Hugo Boss cologne and one for Michael Kors cologne, illustrate this idea. By portraying men and women in different ways, these images can potentially negatively impact the way society views women. So hopefully you notice there that feels a bit long. It's a little bit clunky. It doesn't flow as well as it maybe could. Now, in my right example, take note of how there's not any less information here, really. I'm saying the same thing that I was in my long example. I've just managed to condense it down into one sentence. Now, you may say, like, well, this is quite the long sentence. Shouldn't my thesis be shorter than this? And it depends. It's kind of up to you. There's nothing inherently wrong with a long sentence. As long as your reader can, read and fully understand what is being said in that sentence, then it doesn't necessarily matter if it's especially long. So here, our right example is the two images below, one for Hugo Boss cologne and one for Michael Kors cologne, illustrate Kilbourn's assertion that men and women are often portrayed in drastically different and ultimately harmful ways in contemporary advertising. So I took the three sentences up here and condensed it down into just one. For your thesis in writing project 2, you should also mention your lens in your thesis. So, if you're using Kilbourn or Katz or Shelby, you need to mention them in your thesis statement. However, your thesis shouldn't be the first time that you talk about your lens text. Generally, I find that it's a good idea to talk about your lens text, to introduce it to your reader about maybe halfway through your intro. Usually you want to begin your intro with some sort of hook, some sort of, interesting, thought or idea is going to grab your reader's attention. Then you introduce your topic, and after you make your reader aware of what your topic is, then you can introduce your lens text. And then one more thing, you should avoid saying things like, my lens text is going to be, or Kilbourn provides a lens which can be used. This is kind of a more overarching rule about academic writing where you want to avoid breaking the fourth wall. Some of you might be familiar with that concept. So in academic writing, in college writing, you usually don't want to acknowledge or to admit that you are writing this paper for a course. That tends to make your writing sound. It makes it sound like you are a student. It potentially makes your writing sound maybe a little bit amateurish, which you want to avoid. In college writing, we usually want to make our writing sound as professional as we can. Ideally, you're going to write things that you could, go out and, get published. So you don't want to talk about the assignment. You don't want to talk about, like, I am writing this paper because you want to be nice and to the point. My wrong example here, the movie posters below both fail the racial equity lens test. So here, even though I use the word lens, I'm not actually mentioning my lens text. I'm not letting my reader know the source that I'm going to be engaging with. So the right version of this thesis, the movie posters below both fail Shelby's racial equity lens test. So there's barely a difference between these two thesis statements. But in the second one, I mention the author of my lens text, and presumably I have introduced Shelby's ideas earlier in the intro. So by the time my reader gets to my thesis statement, they already know who Shelby is and a little bit about what Shelby talks about. And then that way they get a better sense of how I'm going to be using Shelby in my paper. Our next point here is to just focus on your images. The claim that you are developing should only be about the two images that you selected. And the main reason for that is that's really the only type of claim that you could reasonably develop or demonstrate in a project like this. This is a fairly short paper, and so it'll be much harder for you to accurately and credibly make a claim about bigger issues. So you shouldn't make a claim about companies or about advertising in general. You shouldn't be making claims about men or women or about races or racism, sexism. You shouldn't be making a claim about the media. you should really only be making a claim about your images. Now, that doesn't mean that your thesis can't mention some of these things. Your thesis is allowed to mention the companies, it's allowed to talk about advertising. You can have a claim be about your images as well as be about racism. Or, you can mention the media and still make a claim about your images. The important point here is that if you were to just claim something about, let's say the media in general, well, that is all of a sudden a huge topic. And you don't really have the evidence to support that because you've only selected two images to look at. So you want your claim to be something that you can fully demonstrate, that you can ostensibly prove with just the images that you have found. So our wrong example here, advertisers use female dismemberment to sell their products. Now, this isn't a good thesis because it's making a claim about the advertisers and not about the two images that are going to be discussed in this paper. The correct version, the images below demonstrate Kilborn's claim that advertisements often make use of female dismemberment to sell their products. So you'll notice that I am talking about how advertisers are, often using female dismemberment to sell their products. Um, you know, I I'm still mentioning Kilborn, but I'm making a claim specifically about the images themselves. The images below are doing these things. I'm not making a claim just about advertisements in general, and that is an important difference in this project. Next, you'll want to be as specific as you can. Generally, the more specific your claim can be, the better. Being specific is a good way to make sure that your reader knows exactly what you're going to be talking about. So if you use kind of vague language, you don't specify what exactly you're talking about, your reader's not going to have a super clear idea of what you are claiming or what they are about to see in your writing. If you can, you should identify what your images are doing. So you are reaching a claim, you're reaching a conclusion about your images, and you came to that conclusion based on something going on in your image. So if you feel like your image is sexist, why do you think that? And that's going to be pretty important to identify in this project, if not in the thesis itself. So if your ads are using a specific racial stereotype or a specific sexist marketing technique, you should probably mention that in your thesis. If you are, specifically going to be looking at how your ads use language, you should mention that. If you are going to be looking at how the model's clothing suggests, something about them, you should probably mention that in your thesis. So, my first example here is not wrong. This is a fine example. This gets the job done, let's say. So, the images below confirm Katz's idea that media often portray men in an unrealistic way. So you'll notice that it's mentioning the images, it's mentioning the lens text, it's making a claim about them. But we could probably make this a little bit better, a little bit more specific. So the better version is the images below, through their use of violent imagery, confirm Katz's idea of the tough guys. So here I'm adding in that I will be specifically looking at violent imagery. I've made it clear to my reader what aspects of the image I'm going to be looking at, and I also make it clear how I'm going to be using Katz. I'm not talking about all of Katz's idea. I'm specifically looking at Katz's idea of the tough guys. And so I took what was, a fine thesis, and I've made it a lot more specific to give my reader a better idea of what I'm going to be talking about. And my last recommendation for you is to avoid using the word you, or in other words, you don't want to write in second person. And this is actually a good rule to follow for most types of academic writing. Usually you want to avoid talking directly to your reader. A big reason for this is it can come across as informal or potentially even impolite to talk directly to your reader. It's also, I found that by using you, by using second person, a lot of times you're making assumptions about who your reader is or what they will or will not notice or things that they will or won't care about. So in this sort of collegiate writing, you want to focus mostly on what you have to say. Now that as a side note, that doesn't mean that you are completely ignoring your audience. It is important to think about who is going to be reading your paper, but try not to talk directly to them. In my example here, the wrong version, you will notice how the images below both fail Shelby's racial equity test. So this is incorrect because it uses the word you. I'm talking directly to my reader here. But as I mentioned, this is kind of making an assumption about my reader. I'm telling my reader, you will notice, but what if they don't? What if my reader wasn't going to notice that? What if they, don't really believe what I'm saying? So instead, you want to do what might be considered more like neutral wording. So my correct example here, the images below fail Shelby's racial equity test through their use of black stereotypes. So in this thesis, I'm getting right to the point, and I'm not telling my reader, you're going to notice this, or you should care about this. I'm just stating my claim. So those are all the tips that I have for you for writing a good thesis for writing project 2. What I would do is I would take a look at your thesis and compare it to this list here. Go through your thesis and make sure that you are either doing or not doing each of these things. And then if you are still kind of unsure about the quality of your thesis or you want some feedback, feel free to email me about it and I can read over your thesis and give you my thoughts on it and give you some suggestions for how it can be improved. But if you follow these steps here, you should be in a pretty good place. What you can also do is compare your thesis to the examples in this video. All of the correct examples that I look at are perfectly fine and in some cases very good thesis statements for this project. That's all that I have for you for now. If you have any questions or concerns, be sure to let me know.